I'm going to talk about the representation of the Jews in Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. The image on this slide is one of Rebecca and her father, Isaac of York, who are the two main Jewish characters depicted in this story. To start out, I'll give a brief history of the Jewish community. So the Israelites, or the Jewish people, trace their heritage back to Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Israel, or Jacob. And they are seen as the patriarchs or the fathers of the Jewish faith. The 12 sons of Jacob are what the 12 tribes of Israel originated from. And these three patriarchs are represented in the image on this slide. The Jewish nation was first united under Moses after their exile from Egypt. Following this, he led them to Israel. From 1000 to 587 BCE was a period of kings in which Israel was ruled by Jewish leaders. However, in 587, the Babylonian army took over Israel and exiled the Jews to Babylon, or modern-day Iraq. Following this, they returned, but again in 333 to 63 BCE, the region was conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greeks. But during this time period, the Jewish people were allowed to remain and run their state to some degree. However, in 63 BCE, Titus and the Roman army took over Israel and exiled the Jewish people once again. At this point in time, the Jewish people kind of fled Israel and many immigrated to northern Africa and Europe. After which, Israel changed hands under several different empires until 1099 to 1291, where we see the Crusades, which were a series of holy wars in which Christian people came over from Europe following the appeal of Pope Urban II to recapture the Holy Lands. And in this goal, or in this objective, they massacred many of the non-Christian populations. This also corresponded with a rise in anti-Semitic sentiments or anti-Jewish sentiments in Europe in general. Skip ahead, and it wasn't until 1948 when Great Britain recognized the right of the Jewish people to re-establish a home nation in what was Palestine. I briefly mentioned the Crusades before, and it is during this time period that Ivanhoe is set. Richard the Lionheart and Wilfred of Ivanhoe have just returned from the Crusades in the eastern lands and are now making their way back into Europe. Ivanhoe attempts historical accuracy in its description of the state of the Jewish people. Their lack of lands lead them to emigrate and subserve to landowners in the areas in which they have moved to. Rebecca reflects on this during her trial for witchcraft. Those who are no longer their own governors and deniers of their own free independent state must crouch before strangers. Throughout the story, Rebecca and Isaac must bend to the will of the Normans and Saxons surrounding them. Isaac, when he is first introduced, is described in the passage above. In this passage, the narrator describes Isaac of York and intercedes his commentary, referring to the time as these dark ages and remarking on the context to which the Jewish people may have come to be viewed as unfriendly, merely as a response to the persecution they faced at the hands of the Christian populations. During the time Ivanhoe was written, or just prior to it being published in 1819 and 1820, the Hep Hep riots occurred. The etching below is an etching of the so-called Hep Hep riots. These riots were mainly occurring in Germany against German Jews, but did end up more widespread throughout Europe. The violence against the Jews and their property was thought to be triggered by the issue of Jewish emancipation, which was being debated at the time. These two time periods, the one Sir Walter Scott writes about and the one he writes in, seem to mirror each other, as they are both times where anti-Semitism was prevalent throughout Europe. His story depicts the persecution of the Jews and emphasizes their status as second-class citizens. Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe, to me, seems to be making an appeal to the populace on behalf of the Jews. In chapter 5, he quotes The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food and hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same disease, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter as summer as a Christian is. This quotation, to me, seems an appeal to the common humanity of both Christians and Jews. In his story, he depicts both the faults and the goodness of these people. He shows Isaac as a money-hungry old man, but one who also goes out of his way to help others outside his religion. Rebecca is perhaps one of the more virtuous characters in the story. She is unwilling to give up her virtue for any reason, and furthermore is kind and always lending a hand to anyone in need. When reading about Ivanhoe, I found this review in The Guardian. I found it quite interesting, and it mentions how Ivanhoe provides a myth for English origin or English identity. It talks about how it creates a stage for reconciliation between the Saxons and the Normans, and Ivanhoe is seen as a Saxon knight who serves under Richard, a Norman king, bridging the gap that had been pulling these two groups apart. However, this review mentions that the only group that seems inherently unwelcome is the Jews. They don't have a place in England, and Rebecca satirizes this at the end. She, in her trial for witchcraft, she undergoes a dubious legal process for which extrajudicial powers have been assumed and which may result in the death penalty.
This section will begin our analysis of King Richard Coeur de Lion. He's also known as King Richard the Lionhearted, although his French title is more apt because it's unlikely that he even spoke English. He was born on September 8th in 1157, and he was the third son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because of his position as third son, it was unlikely that he would ever become king. However, he was crowned ruler of England in September 3rd, 1189, and reigned until his untimely death on April 6th, 1199, at the age of 41. During his 10-year reign of England, he reportedly only spent 6 months actually in the country. Much of what we know about King Richard's character and his history comes from his participation in the Crusades. In 1188, after hearing of the fall of Jerusalem to the Sultan Saladin, King Richard started to prepare his army. Financed by the Saladin tithe, a tax around 10% of revenues and properties that was levied on England and small parts of France, he began recruiting men for his crusade. Although he was ultimately unsuccessful in recovering Jerusalem from Saladin, his participation in this crusade and his eventual capture on the way home would become the cornerstone of his legacy and define his rule. King Richard's treatment of his subjects was very controversial. As mentioned before, he only spent around 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. He was too preoccupied with securing his own glory to worry about the condition of his country. His treatment of Jews was particularly enigmatic. During his coronation ceremony, he had prevented Jews from attending. In spite of this, several Jewish leaders arrived with gifts in hand. Because they were not allowed to attend, they were stripped, flogged, and then tossed out of the court. This act appeared to sanction violence against Jews and instigated a riot across London. The riots became so bad that Richard was forced to sign a royal writ demanding that the Jews be left alone. His reason for this was likely that he needed the Jews as money collectors to finance his crusades, as he often used England as a source of income rather than concern himself with ruling it properly. As the third of King Henry II's sons, Richard was no stranger to defending his territory from ambitious nobles seeking to dethrone him and his family. Differences between King Henry II and his sons about the nature of succession and territorial acquisitions led the sons to revolt against their father. The sons wanted Henry the young king, the firstborn son, to have complete rule over England so as to not complicate things. Eventually, Henry II subdued his sons' revolts, and the crown was passed to the young king after his death anyway. After Henry the young king's death, Richard is crowned king, much to the dismay of his brother John, who begins to plot against him during his absence in the Crusades. A great deal of Scott's novel is based on historical fact. The Norman versus Saxon conflict was purposely aggravated by John in Richard's absence, as the former thought that the instability would help catalyze his succession. The increased hostility between these two groups is what spawned another legend, that of Robin Hood. The discrimination against Saxons led to the creation of this heroic figure, as the Saxons were desperate for someone to rally behind in Richard's absence. In Ivanhoe, Richard's character is divided up between two personas. On one hand, he is the Black Knight, a mysterious figure who is seemingly obsessed with fighting and glory. The character of the Black Knight is in some ways a commentary of Richard's lackadaisical approach at restoring his kingdom. He is called by many to be the sluggish knight, and he doesn't do much to dispel that name. Even when he has returned and has seen the conflict instigated by his brother, John, during his absence, he is in no hurry to restore the kingdom. This character represents the historically accurate notion that Richard was often more concerned with earning glory and honor in battles than in actively ruling his country. Eventually, the true identity of the Black Knight is revealed, and Richard's portrayal becomes noble once again. He commits to seizing power back from his brother John, and sets about restoring good faith between the Normans and the Saxons. Most major events in Ivanhoe have at least some historical basis. Richard was actually imprisoned for a time, and his brother John did actively try to keep him from returning. The quote, "Take heed to yourself, for the devil is unchained," is a real quote sent through note by King Philip of France to John. The two had been conspiring to keep Richard out of England, and when Philip knew that he was returning, he sent this note as a warning. Not everything in the story is completely accurate, however. In this tale, and many others, Richard is seen as a heroic figure. Although he leaves the country in a questionable time politically, he does so to seek out glory in a holy war. This act makes him an easy target to create an idealistic knightly figure, someone who is brave and willing to risk their life for honor. His portrayal in historic records is not always so kind, however. As one historian would argue, he was a bad king. His great exploits, his military skill, his splendor and extravagance, his poetical tastes, his adventurous spirit do not serve to cloak his entire want of sympathy or even consideration for his people. Although this bravery would be the cornerstone of his place in history, he had many other attributes which were not looked on as favorably during his reign. In conclusion, while King Richard may stand out in history as a chivalrous figure, it may only be in contrast with the horrible conditions perpetrated by his brother John. Richard may not have been a perfect king, but after languishing under the rule of his brother, England was more than willing to welcome him back with open arms. Scott's version of Richard idealizes the king, while leaving out some of his less desirable traits. Nevertheless, his position in history has certainly stood the test of time, and most people are willing to forgive his indiscretions in favor of the noble and heroic light he has come to be painted in.
Ivanhoe is the story of one of the remaining Saxon noble families at a time when the English nobility was overwhelmingly Norman. The book is set sometime between 1189 and 1199, which is over 100 years after the invasion of the Normans. Even after so many years, the Saxons are still doing their best to resist the Norman domination. Throughout the book, we can see the tension between the Saxons and the Normans is really high. The Norman invasion of England brought many consequences to those living on the land. For example, the English language was being replaced with French and Latin.
English was now associated with uncivilized and uneducated. The Normans took over the area, and as a result, many of the Saxon landowners were made into serfs. The Saxons were refusing these cultural changes. They refused to learn and speak their language. So it was these practices that have upset the Saxon nobility, Cedric being one of those people. He's very loyal to his Saxon heritage, and he even disinherits his own son, Ivanhoe, for following King Richard to the war. Cedric hopes to reawaken the Saxon royal line by marrying his highborn ward Rowena to Athelstan. There's many instances throughout the book where we see the tension between the Saxons and the Normans. Like, for example, in the beginning of the book, there are Normans who are asking Saxon servants for directions to the nearest castle. The Saxons purposely give the Normans the wrong directions, which is very uncharacteristic of the Middle Ages, when they had a strong code of ethics and hospitality. So the Saxons would rather break these rules instead of help the Normans. Ivanhoe's character is seen as a possible solution to the tension between the two groups. It's not because of something Ivanhoe does. He's actually pretty inactive throughout the book due to his injury, but it's more about what he represents. He's this Saxon knight who's passionately loyal to King Richard, who's a Norman king. His decision to follow the king to war results in a ruined relationship with his father Cedric. The tension between the Normans and Saxons is caused by their nationalism. And Ivanhoe is someone who judges people according to their character rather than their national origin. Throughout the book, we see what both of the groups would have to lose in order to band together and have any hope of a unified future. The particular loss is in the extremes of their own cultural values. For the Saxons, this value is the final admission of the hopelessness of the Saxon cause, and the Normans must learn to overcome the materialism and violence in their own codes of chivalry. The book ultimately ends on a positive note for the Saxon and Norman relationship. Cedric forgives Ivanhoe for siding with King Richard, and by allowing Ivanhoe to marry Rowena, he gives up on his dream of another Saxon king in the English throne. So by the end, we see this new relationship forming between the Saxons and Normans where they can finally begin to coexist peacefully.